context. Okay, now that you sort of have the Enoch story in your head, where does it come from? Again, it comes from the same, not source. It is a response to, and I think a fuller preservation of the episode that we find in Mesopotamian literature associated with the flood. The biblical stuff, Genesis 6:1-4, this whole weird episode, is a response to something that the Mesopotamians wrote about and believed and thought it was great, thought it was good. The Israelites thought it was wicked and evil. So there's an opposition there. And so Genesis 6:1-4 is in the Bible to tell the Israelites that these events that preceded the flood were not good. They were evil. And it's going to ripple out into biblical history in all sorts of ways to sort of make that case. The story centers on the Apkallu. The Apkallu are the culture heroes from before the flood. The phrase culture heroes refers to the great civilizers. So, Thomas Edison would be a culture hero for us because, he harnessed the power of electricity to give us lights, okay? People, figures who do something really important to civilize life. Okay, that's what a culture hero is. In Mesopotamian thinking, the Apkallu are the great culture heroes from before the flood in the service of Ea. Ea was the god of wisdom. A variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian, the pre-flood period, were supposedly passed on by the Apkallu. There were 7 of them in one particular story. The 7 sages were created in the river. The Akkadian for that term is in the abyss. So right away, you're getting a little creepy thought here. Okay, they're from like the underworld place. But the Mesopotamians thought they were great guys. Okay, they're wonderful. The 7 sages were created in the river, the abyss, and served as, quote, those who ensured the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. They were really smart. Following the example of Ea, they taught mankind wisdom, social forms, and craftsmanship. That's from DDD. The Apkallu, then, were the wise divine beings from the abyss, from the underworld, the place opposite the heavens. They were responsible for maintaining the correct balance between heaven and earth. That was the will of the greater gods. And they possessed knowledge from the divine world that sort of made heaven and earth tick. Again, they knew lots of stuff. Well, the scribes of Babylon living after the flood took great pains to establish the notion that their own knowledge, what we scribes know, and therefore the greatness of Babylon. This is why we're so smart, and this is why Babylon's so great. Why? Because our knowledge has been inherited from the Apkallu. Like they were our teachers and our mentors. Our knowledge, the reason Babylon is so great, again, in the eyes of the Mesopotamian, is that what we know, what we have built, the civilization that we have created and fashioned, and that is at the top of the heap. There is no greater place than Babylon. All of that comes from the gods. It's divine knowledge. And we as scribes are sort of the gatekeepers to that knowledge. Again, there's a little bit of a propaganda feel to this, obviously. But this is the explanation for why people should listen to them and why Babylon is so great and so awesome. Now, the question, though, that surfaces is, well, these guys were from before the flood, so how did you guys inherit this knowledge? Because the Mesopotamians had the same flood story, and the great flood. So here's how they argue it. Mesopotamian text, again, this is very distilled. They got a whole chapter of citations on this. Mesopotamian material lists 7 pre-flood kings. There's a particular text that actually gives you a king list, kind of like the stuff you see in the Bible where so-and-so king reigned X number of years and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's a particular text that lists the king, and then next to the king's name is the name of the Apkallu who helped him be king, helped him, have the civilization flourish, okay? Gave him the knowledge he needed to run, Babylon, okay? So there's 7 of these guys before the flood. They are assisted by a specific Apkallu. Then after the flood, the text has 4 Apkallu, and they are described this way. They are of human descent. The pre-flood Apkallu are consistently described as being gods, divine beings. But after the flood, no, they're of human descent, and they are only 2/3 Apkallu. The fourth one is actually given a number. He's mixed, he's a hybrid, whatever term you want to use there. It's the same description, although in the text it's not the same person. It's the same description given to Gilgamesh, who is also referred to as Lord of the Apkallu in something called a cylinder seal. Gilgamesh was an Apkallu. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine. Gilgamesh was also a giant in the Mesopotamian text. Again, Gilgamesh is probably the most familiar figure from the ancient Near East and, just in popular circles. Well, he turns out to be a key figure here because he is a post-flood Apkallu who is a mix, divine and human, and also happens to be a giant along with these other guys. So you see, in this book, the last note there, you may not have known this, but Gilgamesh is actually mentioned by name in something called the Book of the Giants from Qumran. The Book of the Giants is not part of First Enoch, but it is described by scholars as Enochian material because a lot of the content of the Book of Giants you can also find in the Book of First Enoch. And there are a couple other giants named there as well, in connection with the flood, before and after, so on and so forth. But Gilgamesh is actually in there. So just that one line, I just want to pause here a second, just that one text tells you that the Jews of this period were reading Mesopotamian stuff. Because you don't just start writing a book and, I need a name for this giant. What should I call him? Gilgamesh. Well, that sounds good. Where'd that pop into my... No, that isn't how it happens. They're reading Mesopotamian material. They had inherited Mesopotamian stuff. It's part of their framework. It's part of their, scholars would call, cognitive frame of reference. They were just familiar with the material. And they could tell, they knew, because they were familiar with the material, they could look back at Genesis 6:1-4 and say, oh yeah, we know what's going on there. We know what that's about. And again, they write about what that's about in books like the Book of the Giants, books like First Enoch. Again, this is all a matrix of ideas. And the reason, again, it's unfamiliar to us is because, now I hate to put it this way because it sounds pejorative, but I'm going to say it this way. It's because we're not allowed to read that other stuff. If you did, the lights would just go on in different places as you expose yourself to material. Again, the implication of all that, just look at the list here. The implication is that the post-flood Apkallu were the result of intercourse with human women. Now, in her essay on the Apkallu, this scholar named Ann Kilmer, she wrote an article. It's actually a chapter of a book. It's kind of hard to find. I don't think it's available online for free. If you were blessed enough to get in on the Divine Council bibliography project, this article is in that collection. But she actually picked up on this years ago, but didn't say a whole lot about it. She writes, humans and Apkallu could presumably mate, since we have a description of the 4 post-flood Apkallu as of human descent, the fourth being only 2/3 Apkallu as opposed to the pre-flood pure Apkallu and subsequent human sages. After the mixed Apkallu die off, there's another term that's used in Mesopotamian text. It's the umanu, and that was the term for scribe. So you can see what the texts are suggesting. Divine knowledge comes from these pre-flood guys. It survived the flood in these hybrid guys, and we inherited it. That's why you should listen to us. That's why we're so smart. That's why Babylon's so great. Again, this is what they're doing. This is how they're framing it. Now, the apparent mating with humans displeased Marduk. Marduk is the high god of Babylon. He's the top of the heap. In the Era epic, he judges the Apkallu. This is Marduk speaking here in the text. I sent craftsmen, that's how the Apkallu are called, craftsmen, the guys who know lots of stuff, okay? I sent craftsmen down to the Apsu, again, back to the abyss. I ordered them not to come up. I changed the location of the Mesu tree and the El Meshu stone and did not show it to anybody. Now that reference is lost on us, but Again, this is a quotation from, again, another particular scholar. Relocation of a tree, this is from Anus, I believe, and stones is also a motif in the Era epic, where Marduk during the flood changed the location of this tree and the stone in the context of sending the sages down to the abyss, to the Apsu. The garden with trees and precious stones, again, what does that make you think of? Ezekiel 28. I mean, it's the Edenic description. It's the same thing. Trees and stones. Again, it's not a coincidence. And if you read Ezekiel 28, it's very Canaanite in flavor, and the Canaanite divine council stuff, again, plays off of part of the same framework as the wider ancient Near East. Again, these are not coincidences. This is just literary artistry from people familiar with lots of material, and they're writing a book and they're throwing it in. This is how books are made. It's not, a terrible surprise here. It's very comparable to the garden. And then in the end of the hero's journey in the Gilgamesh epic, again, Gilgamesh is seeking what? Eternal immortality, eternal life. He goes to where the gods are in this garden. Does this sound familiar? Okay. And it should. It's impossible to miss in these words Ezekiel's language of Eden. There in chapter 28, combines garden imagery, mountain imagery, lustrous precious stones, so on and so forth. The imagery from Marduk's comments about what he had done to the Apkallu, in effect, points to the banishment of the Apkallu from his own presence. Marduk's ticked. He said, you guys did this. We up here, okay, in the heavenly places, we sent the flood because we wanted, the slate wiped clean. And what you guys did was you went down there and preserved not only, some of the people, again, the wider flood story, but also the thing that sort of just made the situation bad to begin with, or at least unfavorable, maybe to them or to us, but not to them, because they loved, having all this divine knowledge. This is, they thought this is what made them great. And now here you go again. You've interfered, and this is all going to, again, start up again. We don't want humans knowing what we know. We want them lesser. We want them, if you're familiar with Mesopotamian stories, why were humans created? To be slaves of the gods. Okay? So Marduk is ticked. So he sends them back to the abyss. You're gonna just be here now. You're gonna be cut off from my presence. And this is where you're gonna stay. Again, does it sound familiar? This is what happens in the Enochian story we just read. It's the same set of details. They get punished, they get sent to the abyss. They're imprisoned there. Here's the summary. Again, I'm not going to read you all the points, but every point of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and every point of Enoch's version of it aligns with Mesopotamian material. Every point. What do I learn from that? What does that tell us? Again, it tells us that the people who are writing this stuff, Jewish people, Jewish scribes, again, these are not like theological illiterates, okay? And they're not just, crazy liberal Jews, okay? These are the guys who are in charge of transmitting the Hebrew Bible, transmitting the traditions, of their own people. They understand and they know the larger picture against which Genesis 6, 1 through 4 responds. They understand it, they've read it, they get it. And in their own literature, they not only play off Genesis 6, 1 through 4, but they play off the bigger backdrop, and they preserve it for us. And the point of my book is to say, well, that isn't all that happens, because since from the Second Temple period, we get guys like Matthew. We get guys like Mark. We get guys like John. We get guys like Peter. Okay, this is their world. The early church, the 12 apostles, again, shocker of shockers, were Jews, and they had read stuff. Like, what a profound thought. They weren't illiterates, okay? They were Jews who had been exposed to this material, And again, they're providentially chosen, they're providentially prepared to produce the books that we now call the New Testament. And in the course of writing those things, they're going to use stuff that's floating around in their head to express themselves, to express certain ideas. And God's good with that because he picked them. Okay, he picked them, put them in the right time and place, and said, I'm going to prompt you now to write something down that I want preserved for posterity. But we wouldn't know that unless we went looking, okay, unless we thought about what they're doing. Now, I've made the comment before that I think our doctrine of inspiration, I think, is undermined and made vulnerable when we divorce the human element from it. Okay, the books of your Bible do not just come by mental download. The prophet's not getting up, making breakfast, gets zapped, he loses control of his mind, his automatic writing, like in the X-Files, okay? He wakes up and says, wow, I can't wait to read what I just wrote. Okay, that is not how the New Testament itself describes inspiration. But we think like the people who produced the books of the New Testament weren't thinking about anything. Like they just got zapped and downloaded. Okay, when you strip the human element out of it, when you make it this paranormal object, it's very understandable if you believe that inspiration operates this way, that you don't want people reading anything else. You don't want them exposed to what actually the writers had exposed themselves to. And so this problem, this disconnect of how to understand what's in our own Bible is a lot bigger than when we sort of imagine it. You know, you're talking about centuries, millennia of a crude history of looking at the Bible in a certain way. And again, it's not sinister. It's not like some cabal somewhere. We've got to cut people off from anything that's not. That's not it. It's just sort of a reflexive way it's taught. It's nothing, you know, deeply sinister, but the effect of it is we have people who are underexposed to the context of the Bible, and then they have trouble understanding significant portions of it. That's the problem. And that's, again, what I'm trying to put a little dent in. Now, the other three parts, let me do a time check here. Yes, those of you have noticed that I actually have an iPhone this time. And I'm using it. Okay, a little time check there. Now, what I do from this point on in the book is, again, I go through all of that in 3 chapters because I want the story in your head and I want the context in your head. And now we're going to traipse through the New Testament and see, where does this stuff show up? If we were thinking about all this stuff, what would we see in a given passage that would sort of jump out at us? And again, put us on different lines of thinking. And I would suggest lines of thinking that were in the writer's heads. Now, for the gospel section, I do something with the birth, the genealogy, and the ministry of Jesus. The last one, about 2/3 of that chapter is from Unseen Realm. I throw in the story of Legion, which is new. But the first 2, again, you would have had to have read really the Portent, the second novel, to get any of that, or maybe come across something on YouTube. But as far as the birth of Jesus would have alerted literate first century Jews that the Messiah's arrival would reverse the sin of the watchers. And you say, that's just crazy talk. How in the world would hearing about the birth of the Messiah have made anybody think about Genesis 6, okay, the watchers thing? How does that work? It works because of Romans 10, specifically Romans 10:18 and following, Revelation 12, which is the astral signage of the birth of the Messiah, and again, various Second Temple traditions about the birth of the Messiah. Now, to summarize all that real quickly, again, you may have seen, how many of you have seen the YouTube thing of me going through Revelation 12 about the astral prophecy? Oh, very few of you, wow. Okay, during Q&A, if you want to drill down there, we could, but I'll give it to you in summary form. In Romans 10, Paul is it's the famous passage where Paul is talking about, hey, how are people going to hear about the Messiah unless somebody tells them? Duh. Okay, and so we have this problem. How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel, and no one's going to hear without a preacher, and the preacher has to be sent, and that whole famous passage. Then Paul asks a rhetorical question. Have they not heard? And you expect him to say, well, of course they haven't heard, Paul. That's why you're so exercised. That's why you're so bent out of shape here. And you're telling us we need to go and be witnesses. But he doesn't say that. Paul says, indeed they have. And you're like, what? Well, what was the other 17 verses about? How does this fit? And he quotes as his proof text that they have all heard. He quotes Psalm 19 in Genesis 10:18. Psalm 19 is the passage. The heavens declare the glory of God. Okay. There are four verbs of messaging in the first couple verses. Heavens declare, they pronounce, they utter, they have a voice, okay, all this stuff. And it's just sun, moon, stars, and all this kind of thing. And the line that Paul quotes is, their voice has gone out through all the earth. The voice of what? Well, the voice of the heavens. And that's the Septuagint. The Masoretic text actually reads, their line has gone out through all the heavens. And I actually like the Masoretic text there because it's a reference to the ecliptic, the line in the sky. The ecliptic is where the zodiac constellations follow on an annual basis. So I can't prove it, but what I think Paul was referring to is Revelation 12. When John says, he's talking about the birth of the Messiah, it's Revelation 12, he says, I looked up at the heavens and saw. I think John actually meant what he said. Okay, we've got the woman with the 12 stars around her head, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet. You can actually plot this out on an astronomy program. And when you do, there are other things that aren't mentioned in Revelation 12 that are really significant, again, to a literate person in the first century. You've got a conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter, the king star with the king planet, in the constellation of Leo. Okay, the lion, the tribe of Judah, okay. For a Gentile who doesn't know anything about the Hebrew Bible, that conjunction is important because both of them were signs of a royal divine birth. And here they're conjoined, and for a Jew, it's in the constellation of Leo. You have a 90-minute window when all these things are, it's actually 80 minutes. Somebody corrected me the other day. Got an astronomer geek out there, okay. All right, I'll try to remember that. Well, I'll have to just throw away all my books now. But you have a really small amount of time, okay, where all this can occur. And if you plug it into an astronomy program, you get the birth of the Messiah on September 11th, 3 BC. 3 BC is not a problem. Everybody says, oh, it can't be 3 BC because then Herod would have to die in 1 BC. And we all know Herod died in 4 BC. Yeah, except for studies that have shown that 1 BC works quite well, which I've recently posted on my website. I did a happy birthday to Jesus thing on September 11th. But what makes it important is that date in the Jewish calendar is Tishri 1. Tishri 1 was the date in the Old Testament when you inaugurate the reign of your next king. Tishri 1 was also thought to be the birth date of Noah. So Jesus, the Messiah, is the new Noah. Okay, you're starting to see how Genesis 6 sort of creeps into the picture here. What was significant about Noah? Noah's survival, Noah's presence on the earth post-flood signaled, it was supposed to signal the end of the watchers, the end of all this wickedness, the end of all this garbage, okay? There are passages that refer in, again, Dead Sea Scroll text to the chronology of the flood, okay, to, some of this astronomical stuff going on. Specifically, they link it to the constellation of Orion, which in Aramaic is the constellation of Nephilah. Okay, it's the giant, because Orion was a giant. I mean, you have this concatenation of thoughts that, again, to a literate Jew, if they had read John, or, Revelation is the last book of the New Testament. So John got this information from somewhere, maybe Mary, maybe the disciple, who knows, he's one of the 12. But he writes it down. And if you had been exposed to that, you're thinking, wow, look, if this is what was in the sky, it means this and this and this and this and this. And to a Gentile, all those things are consistent because we've got the conjunction, we've got Jupiter, we've got Regulus, we've got Orion, we've got all this stuff. So when Paul says, yeah, they did know. Okay. I don't believe personally that what Paul is referring to is like, y'all know who D. James Kennedy is? Familiar name? D. James Kennedy believed that you could get the whole plan of salvation out of the constellations of the zodiac. I think that goes too far. I don't believe that. But what I do believe that you could know is that a divine king had been born. I think that is what Paul's tracking on. Again, I can't prove that specifically. There's no verse, there's no footnote in Romans 10:18 that says, go look at Revelation 12. Because Revelation 12 wasn't written yet. So we can't quote it. But I think that's what he's tracking on. But if the point is for the book here, if you had that stuff in your head, somebody born on that day who turns out to be this Jesus of Nazareth, who's walking around doing all sorts of miracles and saying, like, I'm the guy, okay, that would have meant something to you. Okay, that would have meant this is the guy who is going to somehow reverse the effects of the wickedness of the world. Okay? It's not a terribly deep thought, but to sort of track with it the way they would have tracked it, is a different story. The genealogy, in a nutshell. Why are the 4 women in the genealogy there? They may or may not all be Gentiles, probably at least one of them, 1 or 2. Some people argue all 4 of them are. It's really not important if they're Gentiles, but why are they the ones included? Quote here from, her name is Amy Richter. This is from her dissertation. She says, while the inclusion of women in biblical genealogies isn't unusual in itself, there are 14 such women in other genealogies, namely 1 Chronicles 2. The inclusion of these 4 women is all the more odd. Who are they? Rahab. Anybody name them? You got Rahab, Ruth. See, the neglected, the Bathsheba, and Judah and Tamar, okay? So the quote here is like, you'd think if you were going to put in 4 important women, you'd pick Sarah, Rebecca, okay, Rachel. I mean, major figures in the Torah, but they're not in. They don't get in. The 4 that do are sort of just kind of a mystery. Again, short version of this is that what Richter does in her dissertation, it's pretty recent. She did it at Marquette, which is a school that's becoming known for Second Temple studies. Her argument is that the reason these 4 women are in the genealogy is that there is something in their story, either something they did or something done to them, that has something to do with sexual transgression and the vocabulary used to describe the person and these events borrows vocabulary from Genesis 6. And so Richter argues that can't be a coincidence. And her argument is these 4 women are in here because they're 4 women who have scandalous histories or had something terrible happen to them in the line of the Messiah. And so the telegraphing, her belief is that, and I think she makes a really good case for it, the important point isn't these women and what happened to them and the vocabulary itself, it's who they produce, who they help to produce. Well, who's on the final end of the genealogy? It's Jesus of Nazareth. And so the one whose genealogy it is going to reverse the effects, again, of the 4 people in the genealogy that had these transgressive histories that point back in some way to Genesis 6. So she believes that Matthew essentially encrypted. I mean, for people who knew their stories, it wouldn't really be encryption, but for us, it sort of is. People would have read the genealogy and asked, well, why are these women and not all the famous ones? And then as they thought about their histories, it's like, oh, okay, well, boy, her story goes back there, her story goes, they all go back there. That must mean something. Matthew's trying to tell us something. And what he's trying to tell us is that these 4 women who you associate as Jews with this event, they're going to produce the one who undoes this. They're going to play a role here.